Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see such a big audience here. And I must say, I thought, judging by the headlines, this would be a much thinner audience. I thought half of South Africa was immigrating right now. You would have assumed so if you listen to my show, because we pride ourselves in delivering a bit more of a balanced view. But certainly if you read some of the newspapers, to Wendell's point, the media does trade on fear. It's the stock in trade in the media game. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the first thing you're taught in Media Studies 101. And we'll come to that. But I'd like to introduce myself in a slightly different way. And thank you, Natasha, for that introduction earlier. But my name is Michael Avery. I'm the host of Avery Means Business on Clinton News Network. And the year is 2029. We're 1 year away from the National Development Plan. And I'm in the States with a bit of seller's remorse. You see, what I did is I sold my house in the year 2019. I was one of those who was living in fear. And right now, South Africa in the year 2029 is grabbing all the global headlines. And not because we are the next Venezuela or the next Zimbabwe, but because South Africa globally has had some of the best stock market returns amongst emerging markets. Property prices over the last 5 years have doubled, and I'm a little bit upset with myself for leaving my country of birth and quite frankly missing all of the good rugby, the good banter. And my daughter's also got a Cura, and I'm not quite happy with the schooling they're getting over in the States. I'm a little bit worried they might get shot up. But you might think that's a bit of a provocative introduction. How can we take South Africa today and extrapolate 10 years into the future and think that we're going to be in a better place? So just to get to the beginning of, am I heading in the right direction? There we go. Right, so to dial it back, where did that all begin? It started at the end of the rainbow. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Rainbow Nation ideals of Nelson Mandela and that very famous speech that he delivered at his inauguration back in 1994. And hands up in the room if you didn't think back then, a year later after winning the Rugby World Cup and then a year after that, watching the boys lift the African Cup of Nations, that you didn't think South Africa was going to be in a far better place today, that we would start to see real dents in unemployment, that we would finally start to see some of the national unity that Nelson Mandela wanted to see permeating South African society. The fact of the matter is, we were well on our way there. We were well on our way in the mid-2000s. In the build-up to the global financial crisis, we were growing at 5%. We had economic policies under President Mbeki that were far more business-friendly. And we were starting to make very slow progress in chipping away at our very high unemployment rates. Then 2007 happened, and I think we all know there, from a policy perspective, what happened to South Africa, and we veered off course. Now, the question is whether or not the end of the rainbow is a good thing or a bad thing. As investors, we've got to ask that. As concerned South Africans, we have to ask ourselves, is the end of this idealism that was Rainbow Nation, everyone loving each other across racial lines, across class divides, was that reality? And quite clearly, I think it was needed at the time of the transition from apartheid to democracy, but it wasn't grounded in reality. And the fact of the matter is, South Africans to this day, even in the office or if you go to a school like Curo, have a very thin sense of this national identity or this national unity that is rainbowism. But there is always another side to what is seemingly a gloomy outlook or a gloomy perspective on the country. And just by a show of hands, how many of you are optimistic, would consider yourselves optimistic that by 2029, 1 year out from the National Development Plan, South Africa will be in a better place than we find ourselves now? It's so interesting because we've done this around the country. and to see which audiences are more optimistic or pessimistic. Who would consider themselves pessimistic and say South Africa is going to be worse in 2029 than we are today? Don't be afraid, there's no right or wrong. There's absolutely, you see, that there is no right or wrong, and the ability to forecast the future. If anyone stood up here and said they profess to know exactly what the future holds, well, they're lying, because we continue to create our future every day. But the advantage of scenario planning and connecting the dots of today to tomorrow to next week to next year, what gives us a bit of a sense of a framework, that roadmap that Alex was talking about, if you want to bring it back to financial planning. So I think what we've seen in this room is quite clearly that the optimists and the pessimists are split down the middle. We had far more optimists down in Pietermaritzburg, maybe it's the weather down there, and far more optimists in Cape Town, maybe that's because it's run by the DA. I'm just speculating. So there's a third category who are the realists. Now, stick your hands up if you think South Africa is just going to muddle and bumble along over the next 10 years. Right. So this is why all the smart money is in Johannesburg, because we've got more realists than anything else in the Johannesburg audience. And this is the constant battle, the battle between the pessimist, the optimist, and the realist. Now, I would much prefer to be optimistic and proven wrong than pessimistic and proven right. But I do think it's very useful to sit somewhere in the middle and to look at the realistic worldview. And that realistic worldview has to strip out some of the sensationalism that we get to see in the media. There's definitely some AI or gremlin in the system, isn't there? Which is rather bizarre. Much like, I think, where we find South Africa today. We currently have a reforming president, a constitutionalist, but occasionally the gremlins pop out of the Public Protector's Office to try and defend those who are part of a clear campaign to return us to those days of state capture. Now, the ability to synthesize that view, and I'm going to digress a little bit before we address the realistic view, but if I were to tell you, and there's a very interesting book called The Triumph of the Optimists. It's a global asset research, every single stock market and every single asset class in the world going back over 100 years. If I were to tell you, if you were to take your investments and your retirement savings and invest them in a country where they had a system that was deemed a crime against humanity for 56 years, where there was a debt default in the 80s, in 1986, a country that was riddled with sanctions, with low skills, a country that suffers one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, but a country that has a rich mineral endowment, but also a country that is bordered by some of the most volatile emerging markets on earth. And I said, give me your retirement money and I'll ensure you get a good return. You'll probably send me packing out the door. But that is South Africa. Over the last 101 years, it's delivered 7.4% real. At an annualized inflation of 4%, that's 3.4%. Over 100 years, that makes it the best performing market according to the Triumph of the Optimists. So do yourselves a favor, great little coffee table, book that. And that over there is just a nice 100-year history of the JSE. And when you zoom out, there's some pretty big crises, global wars, sanctions, the global financial crisis, but quite clearly you can see that staying invested in equities was where you wanted to be. Now, I think to understand where we are, to get the realist worldview, we have to ask three things. How is South Africa really doing? How is the world really doing in comparison? And how is our planet doing? So on that first question, how is South Africa really doing? Well, it's a tough job to try and persuade you that South Africa is on the right path and that things are going to get better. Just last week, we had the ratings agencies, Fitch, come out and downgrade its view from stable to negative. we had the news on Eskom, and as Wendell alluded to, now 129 billion rand more that we as taxpayers, the government, have to spend to bail out the state-owned elephant in the room. Mike Brown today, in fact, in Nedbank's results, called it the sick state-owned elephant in the room. So pretty tough to sell a good story against some of those negative headlines. We've also had record high unemployment figures that came out last week, and revenue shortfalls that we're seeing out of SARS. But consider for a moment what we have seen over the last 18 months. And I'd like to bring your attention to the Zondo Commission and what we see every day. Now, I know many who are quite cynical might say, well, this is another commission of inquiry that has been established just to brush everything and sweep everything under the carpet, and the public memory will fade, and those who are alleged to have stolen so much from taxpayers will get away scot-free. Well, I can unequivocally say that that isn't the case, and we'll share exactly why on the panel a little bit later. But it reminds me of a panel that I was part of in Stellenbosch a couple of months ago with Harry Nell, and he's a prosecutor of some repute. It's quite one thing being aware of wrongdoing, and quite another to bring a case beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal court to secure a conviction. And I think we saw a good example of that when the state rushed in, the MPA rushed in, when Cyril Ramaphosa became the president of the ANC and then the president of the ANC before he was elected and given a mandate. And it related to the Freya dairy farm and the Gupta corruption in that, alleged corruption, I still have to say, I don't know why. And it was tossed out of court because it was hastily prepared. It wasn't a thorough case. And the MPA head, Shamila Batohi, who has only recently been appointed at the end of February, so she's been there for 5 months now, has been preparing and cleaning out a very dirty Augean stable, preparing the dockets and the cases so that when she does bring them before a judge, there is a very high probability of securing a conviction. Now, that doesn't satisfy taxpayers, ordinary South African citizens who have watched as a pack of hyenas. Willenzi Mavavi, if you recall, when he was head of COSATU, referred to this predatory elite that were literally feeding at the trough. So we need to see orange overalls, and we need to see them quickly. But that isn't to say things are not moving in the right direction. The next one there is Tom Moyane. Remember him, Bluster's last stand. Well, they should call it Twitter's last stand, because I see he's taken to Twitter now to try and defend his actions while parachuted in to clean out SARS of the good men and women that had built the receiver into the formidable collection agency that it was prior to 2014. We now have Edward Kieswetter at the helm, and I had Edward Kieswetter on my show not too long ago, and he said, Michael, these things take time. There are 15,000 employees inside SARS, and I wanted to sit down and eyeball each and every one of them. And I wanted to say to each and every one of them that this is our mission. We have to rebuild the credibility of this key institution of state because we've got work to do. And he said, there's the door. If you're not with us, and those who were quite clearly implicated in corruption, there are 3 executives, very senior, that have been suspended, and there are several other cases that are busy being prepared. He's managed to sit down with every single employee now. Just think about how long that takes. He hasn't even been in the job for longer than 3 months. So yes, while we're impatient and we want to see signs of improvement, these things do take time. Then over there, hands up if you've heard of the Public-Private Growth Initiative. Okay, we in the media, I'm going to stick my hand up. We're not doing a good enough job here. It can't be that in a room full of very well educated, I'm sure very well read and learned people, only a smattering of you have heard of the Public-Private Growth Initiative. It's been established under the auspices of Dr. Johan van Zyl, who sits on Toyota's global board, one of our top exports. Back to Wendell's points about the excellence of our people. Is that 10 minutes left? Wow. I do tend to, that's why I've got the whip being cracked, because I do tend to go on a bit. So the Public-Private Growth Initiative was convened by Dr. Johan van Zyl and Rolf Meyer. They met on a plane after that famous Tumamina speech and said, what can we do as business to ensure that we support a president who understands business, who understands that the work is urgent to rebuild confidence and credibility and get confidence back into the South African economy? And so they convened the Public-Private Growth Initiative. It sits inside the presidency, and they have identified 22 verticals in terms of industries and sectors where the key bottlenecks are policy uncertainty, policy incoherence, or the lack of capacity in the public sector in some way. And they've presented these issues to the presidency, and they are working behind the scenes to unlock just under R1 trillion worth of investment over the next 5 years. The job creation numbers aren't massive, but what that will do for confidence cannot be understated. Just this week, I had on a panel the CEO of Accentuate. They're a listed water engineering concern. And Fred Platt said to me, behind the scenes, they met with the PPGI last week. There's a super DG by the name of Mpumi Mpofu, and she basically cracks the whip with all the other directors general and said, the president wants us to get behind the Public-Private Growth Initiative. And once again, there is the door if you don't want to work with business and the president to get the country growing again. Now, unfortunately, it's not the kind of story that sells newspapers. It's not the kind of story that's going to get people clicking on News 24. But these are the microeconomic reforms that we need to see to get this country growing again. But, and there is a big but with this one, and that's why I mentioned it right up front. That little rock there, if you've ever had, I think it's the displeasure now of going to Megawatt Park, is just outside the head office in Megawatt Park, Eskom's head office, and that's where Eskom finds itself, stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment. We're going to have to share that pain around. 129 billion rand, as I said, was already unveiled. It's in a utility death spiral. So to Wendell's point earlier, you know, when you get into situations like the Laffer curve, you try and raise your regulated tariff to get more revenue. The more people will say, well, maybe putting that solar panel on the roof is a good idea now. And so really what needs to happen is for that debt pile to be absorbed somehow, whether it's going to be debt to equity swap by the PIC, whether the government employees pension fund is going to be asked to carry some of that pain. That's what the Chief Restructuring Officer, Freeman Nomvalo, who we finally have from last week's announcement, is going to have to deal with in 6 months. I must just add an aside to that, Mr. Nomvalo reckons he's going to be done with this in 6 months. I think it's going to take a little bit longer than that. So he's slightly optimistic there. But you can't tell me that in 10 years' time, an Eskom that is free of corruption, that has been unbundled into 3 separate units that are not too big to fail, generation, distribution, and transmission, will not be a much better run, managed, and operated utility than it is now. And we're already seeing the amount of independent power producers, both in the coal and the renewables space, being increased. So we'll have a much less risky energy mix in 10 years from now. So that takes me to the rest of the world. How is the rest of the world doing? Well, I hold no candle for either Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, but it's very hard to argue, let's start with America, that what Donald Trump has managed to achieve, despite being a rather divisive figure, is to lead and continue the economic growth that started under Obama and to lead America into uncharted waters. We're now in 121 months of uninterrupted economic growth in the US. That's the longest cycle in US history. The big question is, do these kinds of things die of old age? Well, the jury is out. We did see a very interesting reaction to that Fed cut last week with the dollar strengthening. Inversely or counterintuitively, because you would think when you're cutting rates that would weaken your currency a little bit. But I think it spooked investors, and we're seeing a lot of flight to safety, and the dollar is one of those safe harbors. But politically speaking, I can't see any Democrat candidate. Joe Biden's probably the leader amongst the best amongst a very ordinary bunch. So I think we can expect no more bullshit from President Trump come 2020. He's got to make sure his campaign is about keeping America great. It was make America great, keep America great. And it's important for us because America is that flywheel of the global economy. If the American economy is going well, we're still correlated to what's going on to a factor of 0.8, according to Adrian Saville and many other smarter economists that I chat to on my show. What's going on in the UK? Very difficult to see Boris Johnson navigating his way successfully through a Brexit that has no obvious answers. There's the Irish backstop. Some of these issues are just intractable. So whether or not we see a deal or a no-deal Brexit and a hard Brexit on the 31st of October, that's going to have a big bearing on the outlook for that entire region. So quite frankly, if you look around the world, we've got Trump's trade war, and quite clearly those are not easy to win. There aren't too many other countries that you would say, well, that's a place I want to live because South Africa is doing so poorly. I want to go and live there because there's certainty. The whole world is relatively uncertain at the moment, and that brings me then to our planet. And I think this is probably the most underestimated, but probably the biggest challenge that we as a species are facing at the moment. You chatted to Dr. Mervyn King, who heads up the King panel on corporate governance, and he's driving this increased focus on ESG because he believes this is the biggest existential threat to the human race that we've seen. The fact is, to Wendell's point about the Millennial Development Goals, we now have the Sustainable Development Goals, and a big part of that as well is to ensure we keep global temperature rises below 2 degrees Celsius. It already looks like we probably won't be able to achieve that. So as the world temperature increases in Joburg, we're going to see an average year-round temperature of 21 degrees. What does that mean? What does that mean for crop production? What does that mean for places that are habitable? And how do we respond? How are these issues going to impact how you plan for your retirement? These are certainly questions that you would not have been asking 25, 50 years ago, but you need to be asking these questions in order to navigate a very uncertain future. It's not all doom and gloom, though. Nestle, for example, recently announced that they've made a breakthrough on new packaging because there's a war on plastic. And what they found is a cellulose material that is a good substitute for plastic, but is completely recyclable, biodegradable, and can withstand the stresses and rigors of those big machines that are used to mass wrap confectionery bars. And what they're doing is sharing that IP with their competitors in April next year. Of course, they want to get a little bit of a march on them, but they're doing this as a public greater good. And I do think we're going to see more of this. That's why predicting the future in this space in particular becomes so hard, because as we start to see the collective rise to the challenge of climate change, we start to change that trajectory of a potential disaster when it comes to climate. So where does all of this leave the realist South African? I can't say for certain that we will be in a better space in 2029. And the only reason I can't say for certain is because Cyril Ramaphosa is probably one poisonous mushroom away from us seeing Didi Mabuza in the presidency. But I can say for certain that if we have 10 years of Cyril Ramaphosa as president, a man who is a constitutionalist, who was there around the table at CODESA, who has appointed a very capable and competent cabinet, who has trimmed down for example, he sent back that handbook for ministers. They've trimmed down what you can spend on a vehicle from 1.6 to 1.3 to 700,000 Rand for a minister. He's cracking the whip amongst his own party, and he's got the DGs singing the National Development Plan tune. I can't see that we'll be in a worse position come 2029, and we probably will miss some of those National Development Plan targets, but unemployment will be coming down, prosperity will be increasing, and I'll certainly be presenting Avery Means Business, but not on the Clinton News Network. I'll be presenting that maybe on the Africa News Network run on Netflix, on one of these lovely new streaming services. But with that, I'd just like to leave you with this thought of the rainbow. And I do think that our most, Bobby Godsell said it best, we're a nation that loves to walk all the way up to the precipice, take a peep over the edge, and then pull ourselves back. We need that. I think we're a nation of adrenaline junkies. And I think Charlie Chaplin said it best as well, that you're never going to see a rainbow if you're looking down all the time. So we need to start looking up and filtering out some of the negative news and looking for the opportunities, because there are an awful lot of opportunities. Chatting to the entrepreneurs on my show, and they are grasping them left, right, and center. Thank you.